Hello everyone, I'm Justin and this is a full timeline recap of the Breaking Bad and Better Call Saul universe. If you end up enjoying this video and want to see more from us, then make sure to click that subscribe button and click the bell to know anytime we upload a new video. The release of Better Call Saul's series finale a few months ago also brought an end to what's, in our opinion, the greatest television universe of all time after about 14 years. So we think it's time we took a look back at everything that went down in the 11 seasons across Breaking Bad and Better Call Saul, as well as the Breaking Bad movie, El Camino, in timeline order, going through the events year by year. But if you haven't watched some or any of Breaking Bad, Better Call Saul, or El Camino, then make sure to check them out first, as they'll each be linked in the description, before continuing on with our timeline breakdown of it. To begin, let's jump back to 1992, as Jimmy McGill's out running a scam with his best friend Marco. Growing up in Cicero, Jimmy had gained a reputation for expertly conning people out of their money, even being given the nickname Slippin' Jimmy. But he eventually got himself into some trouble after defecating through someone's sunroof, and is now facing charges of property damage and assault, as well as potentially being labeled a sex offender. So he calls his brother Charles McGill, the co-founder and partner of respected law firm Hamlin McGill, for help. He and his brother have never really seen eye to eye, with Chuck very disappointed in his brother's life choices. But still, Chuck agrees to help get him off, but only if Jimmy promises to completely straighten out his life. And so he does, and says goodbye to Marco and Cicero to move to Albuquerque, New Mexico, where Chuck manages to get him a job in the mailroom at HHM. There, Jimmy meets and builds an intimate relationship with one of their interns, Kim Wexler, as he really starts putting his life together, even being welcomed to dinner by Chuck and his wife, Rebecca. And by 1997, Jimmy, motivated by Kim and Chuck's passion for the law, ends up becoming a lawyer himself, taking an online course at the University of American Samoa to pass the bar in hopes of actually working alongside his brother. But his hopes are dashed when Chuck's partner, Howard Hamlin, the son of HHM's co-founder George Hamlin, informs him that the board has decided against hiring him. So Jimmy quits the mailroom and starts up his own practice. As he struggles to get his law practice off the ground, Chuck begins struggling to keep his marriage together, and ultimately he and his wife split. And things become more troublesome for Chuck a couple years later, as he begins feeling symptoms of a rare condition called electromagnetic hypersensitivity disorder, which forces him to step away from the firm on an extended sabbatical. From then till 2002, he's stuck inside his house with all electrical appliances turned off, while Jimmy looks after him and brings him anything he needs from the outside world. Since leaving the mailroom, Jimmy is still yet to really gain any traction as a lawyer, mostly doing garbage public defender work. But it looks like he might finally get his big break when he lands a meeting with Craig Kettleman, the county treasurer, being accused of embezzling $1.5 million, and his wife Betty. Unfortunately though, they decide against signing with him and instead sign with HHM, considering them a real firm. Following his failed meeting with the Kettlemans, a couple of skateboarders attempt to scam him out of some money by making it appear he'd hit them with his car, but Jimmy knows a scam when he sees one and doesn't fall for it. But their attempted con does give him an idea that could use their combined powers for good, and proposes the skateboarders run their scam on Mrs. Kettleman so he can swoop in and be the hero, and they can make some money out of it. So they agree, but the day of the con, the driver just hits and runs, so they follow after her and realize they hit the wrong car, with it actually being the car of an old Mexican lady who turns out to be the grandmother of Tuco Salamanca, a high-ranking member of the cartel. And after the skateboarders call his Abulita a biznatch, he knocks them out and brings them and Jimmy out to the middle of the desert. Jimmy tries explaining how this is all a big misunderstanding, but it looks like Tuco's gonna kill them anyway. Luckily, Tuco's partner, Ignacio Varga, aka Nacho, allows Jimmy to be let go, believing his story about the Kettlemans. But the skateboarders are only let go after Jimmy successfully manages to talk Tuco down from killing them to just breaking their legs. Not too long after this, Jimmy's met at his office by Nacho, looking for more information on the money the Kettlemans stole so he can steal it for himself. But Jimmy offers him no help, claiming he's a lawyer, not a criminal. So Nacho says he'll do it himself, which prompts Jimmy to anonymously call the Kettlemans later that night and warn them that they might be in danger. But it appears his warning was no help, as the next morning it looks like the Kettlemans were kidnapped, with the cops' prime suspect being Nacho, who'd been seen outside their home by their neighbor. Nacho claims he hadn't gotten the chance to do anything yet though, and threatens Jimmy's life if he isn't able to fix this. And after visiting the Kettlemans' home, Jimmy begins to believe the Kettlemans hadn't actually been kidnapped, but instead went into hiding following his phone call and made it look like a kidnapping. The cops don't buy it, but Jimmy does find one person that agrees with him, that being Mike Ehrmantraut, the parking attendant at the courthouse, who used to be a cop himself and claims he'd seen something like this before. So Jimmy goes out looking for them, and sure enough, he finds them camping not too far from their home, along with the $1.5 million they'd embezzled. He tries convincing them to come back and turn themselves in, but although they agree to come back, they instead offer him a chunk of money to keep quiet about it, which he eventually accepts, and with the return, he's able to get Nacho released and go back to focusing on his career. Now with a bunch of money to work with, with, and he begins specializing in elder law. His services are also later called upon by Mike, as he's been brought in for questioning as part of the cops' investigation in the murder of 2 police officers, Hoffman and Fensky, the former partners of Mike's son, Matt, who was also murdered around a year prior. He doesn't need Jimmy's actual legal services though, and just asks for his help in stealing one of the cops' notepad, to which Jimmy reluctantly agrees and pours coffee on the cop's suit, allowing Mike to grab his notes, from which it's confirmed that they have no evidence proving that the 2 officers were actually killed by Mike. Turns out, during his time on the force, Mike was a corrupt cop, unbeknownst to his son who idolized him. So when his son later joined the force and started facing pressure from Hoffman and Fensky to accept bribes, he refused, forcing Mike to reveal his corrupt past and convincing him to accept. But they still weren't sure they could trust Matt and decided to kill him anyway, so Mike eventually tracked them down and got his comeuppance. Also seeking Jimmy's services now are the Kettlemans, who've decided to fire their attorney at HHM, Kim Wexler, after she tried getting them to accept the deal and admit they're guilty. Although he and Kim haven't been intimate since their time at HHM, they do still seem to care a lot about one another. So instead of taking them on as clients, Jimmy asks Mike to help him steal the money so Kim can hand it over to the DA, as part of the deal that reduces Craig's sentence from 30 years to 16 months. Following this, Jimmy goes back to working with the elderly, and realizes one of his clients' assisted living facilities, Sandpiper Crossing, is overcharging them. So he starts putting together some evidence with the help of Chuck, and it appears to be a big-time case. But Chuck says they won't be able to do it on their own, and suggests handing it over to HHM, to which Jimmy reluctantly agrees, under the impression that he'll at least be able to finally join the firm. But although HHM agrees to compensate them for bringing them the case, with 20% of the final settlement, Howard still refuses to hire him. So Jimmy says he'll just work on it himself until later that night when he notices a call from his phone to Howard, and realizes that it was actually his own brother that didn't want him working at the firm. And Chuck confesses this to be true, claiming Jimmy isn't a real lawyer.
I know what you were, what you are. People don't change. You're Slippin' Jimmy. And Slippin' Jimmy I can handle just fine, but Slippin' Jimmy with a law degree is like a chimp with a machine gun.
So Jimmy agrees to hand the case over to HHM, but tells Chuck he's now on his own. He then returns back home to Cicero, where he reunites with his best friend Marco, and the two spend the night running scams just as they did in their past. But when they head out the next night, Marco suffers a heart attack and passes away, resulting in a heartbroken Jimmy returning back to Albuquerque, where Kim's managed to get him a job at the firm partnered with HHM on the Sandpiper case, Davis and Maine. But just as he gets to the meeting, he decides the law isn't for him anymore, and declines their offer. He's later tracked down by Kim, who hopes to change his mind, but he claims he's done playing by the rules and proves how fun life as a con man is by having her join him in scamming a stockbroker into buying them $50 shots of tequila. Although skeptical at first, Kim actually appears to have a lot of fun, and their excitement leads to them hooking up and rekindling their relationship. But still, Jimmy does eventually decide to go back to being a lawyer and accepts the job at Davis and Maine. Meanwhile, Mike, as a means of providing for his son's wife Stacy and her daughter Kaylee, has begun working a job as a bodyguard for nerdy pharmacist Daniel Wormald, who's been exchanging pills for cash with Nacho Varga. But as Daniel starts bringing in some money, he decides to spend it on a bright yellow Hummer, and upon seeing the car, Mike quits the job, believing it'll draw unwanted attention. So Daniel goes to the deal alone, which of course turns out to be a bad idea, when Nacho, appearing to just be admiring his new car, looks in the glove box and finds a document with Daniel's home address on it, which he later robs of all his pills as well as his baseball card collection, and the latter prompts Daniel to stupidly call the police, who end up finding the hole in the wall where he'd been keeping the pills and bring him in for questioning. So Mike meets with Nacho and threatens to inform his partner Tuco of his side business if he doesn't give back the cards, so he does. And Mike then calls in Jimmy to help lower the cops' suspicion of Daniel, which he does by convincing them the hole contains sexual pie-related home videos. Outside of this, Jimmy's been handling client outreach on the Sandpiper case, and comes up with the idea to create a commercial to attract clients. His boss, Cliff Main, says he's open to it, but Jimmy takes this as an okay and just puts out his commercial, created with the help of some college interns, and it proves to be a success. But releasing an ad without the consent of the board infuriates them, and although they decide against firing him, they do remove his ad. Kim also catches some backlash from this, since she was the one that convinced Howard to vouch for Jimmy. So in an attempt to regain their trust, Kim reaches out to a bunch of old contacts, with one eventually coming through, as her old friend Paige now works for a big local bank looking to expand named Mesa Verde. But this acquisition still doesn't do anything to help her standing, so she begins entertaining offers elsewhere. Jimmy, meanwhile, decides that working at a firm like Davis and Maine just isn't for him, so he goes out of his way to get himself fired, since he wouldn't be able to keep his bonus if he quit. And once fired, he proposes to Kim of starting their own firm together. Kim doesn't want to partner with him if he's not going to play by the rules though, so she instead offers to work as solo practitioners, but in the same office, and he agrees. So Kim hands in her resignation at HHM, while still managing to keep Mesa Verde on as her clients. But when Chuck gets word of Kim leaving and working alongside Jimmy, he meets with Kevin Wachtel, the CEO of Mesa Verde, Verde and Paige himself, and convinces them to stay with HHM instead. The meeting takes a lot out of Chuck though, so Jimmy looks after him for the first time in a while. But while Chuck's unconscious, he sifts through his study and finds the Mesa Verde files, which he then takes to a copy shop to alter the documents, changing the address of their new branch from 1261 Rosella Drive, Scottsdale, Arizona to 1216. Chuck proposing the wrong address ultimately causes their hearing to be postponed for 6 weeks, and for HHM to lose Mesa Verde back to Kim. And this slip-up seemingly drives Chuck over the deep end, as he begins putting space blankets all over the ceilings and walls of his home, claiming the electricity is wearing down his mind. So Jimmy, worried about his brother's mental state, confesses to altering the documents. But it turns out Chuck had been recording him the whole time, and that this was all a ploy to get Jimmy's confession, who he'd suspected was behind it from the start. Jimmy's unaware of the recording though, but eventually finds out about it through his old friend from the mailroom, Ernesto, who'd been acting as Chuck's assistant since Jimmy cut ties with him, and heard the recording while putting batteries in the tape recorder. So an angered and manipulated Jimmy rushes over to Chuck's house, kicks open the door, and berates him as he pries open the drawer containing the recording before destroying it. But once again, this turns out to have been part of Chuck's plan, when he reveals Howard and another of his associates are there as witnesses to Jimmy breaking and entering, as well as destroying potential criminal evidence. So the two meet later, represented by Howard and Kim respectively, for a mediation session, and come to an agreement of only a year's probation if Jimmy admits to everything. But since sabotaging legal documents would result in Jimmy being permanently disbarred, which is all Chuck really wants, he and Kim have to put together a plan of their own. Throughout all this going on with Jimmy, Mike had gotten himself a new job, having been approached by Nacho to kill Tuco for 50 grand, as his addiction to crystal meth has made him even more erratic and unpredictable than usual. But instead of killing him, Mike took the smarter route, and got him locked up by dinking his car and taking a beating from him just as the cops arrived. And with Tuco also being caught carrying an unlicensed firearm, it looks like he's gonna be locked up for a long time. But not too long after this, Mike's met by Tuco's uncle, Hector Salamanca, another high-ranking member of the cartel, who attempts to persuade him into telling the cops the firearm was his so Tuco's sentence can be shortened. Mike refuses at first, but after Hector's twin nephews, Leonel and Marco, show up threatening his granddaughter's life, he agrees. He doesn't actually plan on ending things there though, and sets out to kill Hector, but before he can, he's stopped by an anonymous note telling him don't. Eventually, the man who left the note meets with Mike, and is revealed to be Gustavo Fring, the founder of fast food restaurant chain Los Pollos Hermanos, who's also an undercover meth kingpin working alongside the Salamancas and the cartel. But although he and Hector work under the same boss, Don Eladio, they've never seen eye to eye. When Gus first got into the meth business, he and his partner Max Arciniega met with Hector, Don Eladio, and Juan Bolsa, and during said meeting, Eladio had Hector shoot Max in the head, since he felt the two had disrespected him by secretly dealing under his nose. Gus did eventually gain the favor of the cartel after becoming such a big earner, but he secretly made a vow to force them all, specifically Hector, to suffer for what they did that day. He won't allow Mike to kill Hector though, since he believes he deserves a punishment worse than death. However, he has no problem with him disrupting Hector's business, so Mike ends up getting the Salamancas' original means of distribution shut down, which forces them to begin moving their product through Gus, to the displeasure of Hector. Jumping back to Jimmy, as his hearing before the bar has come up, and things look pretty bad at first after Chuck's backup tape is played, but Jimmy claims he'd only said those things to prevent his brother's mental state from going off the deep end, and that it was all a lie. In response, Chuck explains he's perfectly fine mentally, and that his condition is a real thing, but Jimmy believes he can prove it's all in his head, and pulls out a phone from his pocket that Chuck hadn't reacted to at all. Chuck sees through the scheme though, and reveals the phone's battery had been removed. But it turns out Jimmy had another trick up his sleeve when he asks him to check his breast pocket, which is revealed to have the phone's fully charged battery inside, that had been slipped into his pocket earlier by Jimmy's associate, Huel Babineau, an expert at pickpocketing. And this revelation prompts an angered and embarrassed Chuck to express all of his built-up animosity towards Jimmy, which effectively loses him the case, and Jimmy is only disbarred for a year. Although Jimmy now finds himself with a bunch of free time on his hands, Kim's work life continues to get more and more hectic as she tries to handle Mesa Verde all on her own. And pulling all-nighters to get her work done nearly turns out to be fatal when on her way to a meeting, she falls asleep at the wheel and crashes her car. She doesn't end up with any severe injuries, but nearly losing her causes Jimmy to rethink some of the decisions he's made, specifically destroying the career of his brother. So he goes to meet with Chuck for the first time since the trial, and is shocked to see all of the lights on and electronics running when entering the home. After having it proven that his condition was all in his head, Chuck began his road to recovery, gaining the help of a doctor and eventually even being able to go to the grocery store on his own. But his meltdown at the stand caused HHM's associates to lose trust in him, and in turn the firm as a whole, so Howard suggested Chuck should retire, to which he refused. So Howard, no longer trusting Chuck himself, instead just bought him out of his own pocket. Still, Chuck continued pushing forward and is seemingly perfectly fine by the time he's met by Jimmy, who apologizes for everything and tries to make amends, but Chuck claims there's no need to reconcile.
I don't want to hurt your feelings. But the truth is,
You've never mattered all that much to me.
That night, following their meeting though, Chuck quickly spirals out of control and appears worse than he's ever been, as after not being able to sleep that night, he begins tearing through the walls of his home to turn off any electricity that could possibly be on. But the pain won't go away no matter what he does, so Chuck, no longer trusting his own mind, kicks over one of his gas lanterns, igniting a huge fire that kills him. Upon learning of Chuck's death, Jimmy enters a nearly completely emotionless state, but he's soon taken out of it after a meeting with Howard, who expresses his guilt over Chuck's suicide, believing himself to be the main cause of it, to which Jimmy agrees, and seemingly places any guilt he may have felt onto Howard. Shifting back to the cartel side of things, as Hector's grown angered and more impatient with his current arrangement with Gus, so he seeks out a new business to distribute through, and decides on Nacho's father's automobile upholstery shop, but his father declines every offer they make, not wanting to be involved in their criminal business, so Hector threatens his well-being, which doesn't sit well with Nacho. Knowing he'll have to get rid of Hector if he wants to protect his father, Nacho puts together a scheme to switch out Hector's heart meds for sugar pills, which he successfully manages to do. So the next time he goes to use them, which happens to be during a meeting with Bolsa and Fring, his heart goes berserk and he goes into cardiac arrest. As Hector's being rushed to the hospital, Nacho drives through a bridge and dumps the fake pills into the river. But unbeknownst to him, he'd been being watched by one of Gus's loyal henchmen, Victor. So during their next pickup at the Los Pollos Hermanos chicken farm, Nacho and his current partner Arturo are attacked by Gus and his men, with Arturo being suffocated with a plastic bag by Gus.
I know what you've done. From now on, you are mine.
Now with Nacho working for him from within the Salamanca side of the business, Gus is able to shift his attention to the creation of a secret underground meth lab for when he eventually cuts ties from the cartel. After finding a secure location for the lab with the help of Lydia Rodart Quayle, a business executive at the giant corporation Los Pollos Hermanos is owned by, Madrigal Electromotive, and who also has an odd obsession with stevia.
And I'm assuming you don't have stevia. Never mind. I brought my own.
He brings in Mike to run the operation, as well as some German engineers to actually build it. But to keep the job as low profile as possible, the engineers must stay isolated during the building process, away from their loved ones. As the year progresses though, this eventually proves to be too much for the head engineer, Werner Ziegler, who misses his wife so much that he decides to run off. So Mike leads a search team to find him. But as they head out, they're unknowingly watched by the new head of the Salamanca side of the business, Lalo Salamanca, another of Hector's nephews. Speaking of Hector, although his original diagnosis was pretty bad, he's now been nursed back to health, with his recovery mostly being aided by Gus, as he wanted to make sure Hector would still be aware of the tortures he plans on putting him and his family through. Although he no longer has the ability to speak and is confined to a wheelchair, he's still able to understand conversation and communicate using a bell given to him by Lalo, who's been keeping a close eye on Gus on his behalf. And after seeing Gus's crew all on the move, he begins tailing Mike, who heads to Travel Wire, a money transfer office where Mike learns Werner had been, as well as the spa resort Werner went to after. He eventually notices Lalo tailing him though, and gets away by entering a parking lot and clogging the machine with chewing gum. So Lalo heads back to Travel Wire and kills their employee Fred before looking through the security footage to see what Mike was doing there, and figures out the spa resort Werner went to as well. So he calls him, pretending to be another of Gus's employees, but Mike luckily makes it to Werner before too much information can be revealed. Still, Gus is furious that Werner had escaped and nearly allowed the Salamancas to discover what he's doing, so he orders Mike to kill him. And although he doesn't want to, since he and Werner had become pretty good friends over the course of the project, he reluctantly follows through with the order. After covering up the purpose of their construction project, as well as why they were searching for a Werner Ziegler, Mike tells Gus he's out, feeling great guilt over killing Werner, which subsequently leads to him falling back on drinks night after night and getting into fights with the neighborhood thugs, who nearly end up killing him. But the next morning, he wakes up in Mexico, under the care of Gus's personal doctor, Barry Goodman. Gus also arrives there later, and reveals this place to actually be a memorial for Max, as he attempts to persuade Mike to return to his employ, rather than continuing his self-destructive behavior, claiming he needs a soldier in his war against the Salamancas that understands his need for revenge. And ultimately, Mike accepts. By this point, Jimmy's one-year suspension had finally come to an end, and all that was left was to go through a committee meeting to get reinstated. But the committee shockingly denies him for being what they consider as insincere, and Kim deduces this is due to him not having mentioned his dead brother at all. So at his appeal, Jimmy plans on reading a letter Chuck left him in his will, to show how much he and his brother loved each other. But just as he begins reading it, he breaks down and gives a heartfelt speech about his and Chuck's complicated relationship, which works in getting him reinstated. But it turns out Jimmy had been acting the whole time, and he still doesn't seem to care about his brother's death at all. Nor does he care to work under the name McGill anymore, so he applies for a DBA.
Wait, Jimmy, what?
It's all good, man.
During his year away from the law, Jimmy had gotten a job at a cell phone store, from which he began a side hustle of selling some of their drop phones to criminals for profit under the name Saul Goodman. And for his new law practice, he believes these criminals could actually be great potential clients. But since they don't know him as Jimmy McGill, he'll now be doing business as Saul Goodman moving forward. And it proves to be a success, with him racking in more clients than ever. But soon enough, his new clientele draws the attention of some more frightening criminals, such as Lalo Salamanca, who he's taken to meet by Nacho. Nacho's been having a rough go at it as of late, as Gus's frustration has continued to build thanks to Lalo's arrival, who Gus has put pressure on Nacho to gain the trust of, threatening to kill his father if he isn't able to do so. So Nacho attempts to later following a poker game, during which one of their dealers, Domingo, or Ocho Loco as Lalo called him after Domingo fell for his bluff while having a way better hand, gets caught red-handed by the cops and arrested as they search throughout the rest of the building. So Nacho, realizing this could be the perfect opportunity to gain Lalo's trust, sneaks back into the building and just barely manages to salvage several bags of product. Following this, Nacho becomes Lalo's right-hand man, and is subsequently filled in on his schemes against Gus, with his current idea being to use Crazy 8's arrest to disrupt Gus's business, hence why they meet with Saul. Saul's hesitant to help them at first, but after receiving a pretty big money offer, he accepts, and helps get Domingo a deal to work as an informant for DEA agents Hank Schrader and Steve Gomez. Nacho, of course, tells Gus about Lalo's plans, but Gus can't risk him knowing there to be a rat in his ranks, so he allows some of his guys to get caught, as well as $700,000. After completing this job for Lalo, Saul hopes to be done with anything cartel related, but Lalo makes it clear they'll meet again, so in the meantime, he uses his cartel wage to gain leverage with his other clients. Although Jimmy's law practice is thriving, Kim has once again begun feeling dissatisfied with her current situation with Mesa Verde. After her accident, Kim realized that she couldn't handle all of their needs on her own, so she joined another big firm, Schweikart & Coakley, which in turn allowed her to spend more time doing public defender work, which she found to be much more enjoyable. But her issues with Mesa Verde begin again when in order to build a new call center, they have to force an old man, Everett Acker, off his land. So Kim, not liking the idea of kicking an old man out of his own house for some big bank, instead comes up with a plan using Jimmy's conning expertise and has him become Acker's lawyer, helping him delay all of Mesa Verde's attempts to build their call center. Kevin Wachtel won't back down though, so they put together an even bigger scheme, involving Jimmy creating a bunch of anti-Mesa Verde commercials. But after her boss, Richard Schweikart, starts suspecting she's working alongside Jimmy in favor of Acker and not her own clients, Kim decides to pull the plug. So Jimmy meets with Richard, Kim, Kevin, and Paige to make a deal, but instead of making said deal, he goes through with their original plan and successfully cons them into moving their call center elsewhere. Kim's furious that he went against her wishes, but he claims he only hid it to protect her legally. Still, it looks like this may be their breaking point, until she shockingly suggests they get married, but only to prevent any more secrets since they'll have spousal privilege, and Jimmy agrees, so the two head to the courthouse the next morning to make it official. And although they do seem happy to be married, Kim makes it clear that there can't be any more secrets, no matter how badly Jimmy doesn't want to tell her. But directly after this, his legal services are once again called upon by Lalo Salamanca. After Lalo gave the DEA information to disrupt Gus's business, Gus put together a scheme to get Lalo locked up, having Mike impersonate a detective to anonymously bring police information on who killed the Travel Wire employee. The cops then tracked Lalo down and arrested him, although under his fake identity, Jorge de Guzman, so they don't know they have a member of the cartel in custody. And so Lalo called in Saul to help get him out on bail so he could head back to Mexico before they learn of his real identity. And later, Jimmy's met at his apartment by Mike, who informs him that the people he's working for also want Lalo to head to Mexico. As even in prison, Lalo proved to be a thorn in Gus's side after sending for Nacho to blow up New Mexico's Los Pollos Hermanos restaurant. So Jimmy manages to get him bail, although it's unfortunately set at $7 million. But Lalo says he can make that work and offers Jimmy the job of retrieving the money, to which he agrees in exchange for $100,000. He then meets with the cousins near the border and retrieves the money before driving off. But on his way back, he's ambushed and robbed by what appears to be a rival gang. But before they can kill him, they're suddenly taken out by a sniper in the distance, revealed to be Mike Ehrmantraut, who'd been keeping an eye on the money drop, though he didn't expect the shootout to go down. Jimmy appears traumatized by what just happened, but is able to collect himself as the two start heading back in his car, until it quickly breaks down, so they have to push it over a cliff before moving forward on foot, eventually making it back to Albuquerque after an excruciatingly long walk. Upon his return, Jimmy hands in the money and gets Lalo bailed out, claiming his car just broke down so he had to walk all the way back. Meanwhile, Gus finds out that it was actually Bolsa that set up the hit on Jimmy, believing Lalo's imprisonment would end their feud. Although Jimmy promised to no longer keep anything from Kim, and did tell her that he was going to make the pickup for Lalo, he believes it's best for her not to know what actually went down and sticks with the same story he told him. But she quickly gets an idea of what really happened after finding his coffee cup with a bullet hole in it, and nearly losing Jimmy makes her realize what's truly important, so she drops Mesa Verde and leaves Schweikart & Coakley to focus all of her time on pro bono work. Meanwhile, Lalo begins his trip back to Mexico, but stops after seeing Jimmy's car in a ditch with bullet holes in it, and instead heads back to confront Jimmy at his home. He repeatedly asks him to retell his story, hoping he cracks. But before he does, Kim interrupts and fearlessly questions Lalo, who admits he'd seen Jimmy's car. So Kim comes up with a cover, claiming that in New Mexico, if you leave a car on the side of the road, someone's gonna shoot it up, and claims that he needs to get his house in order instead of relying on a lawyer he barely knows to do his bidding. So Lalo leaves and finally makes his way back to Mexico, while Jimmy and Kim hide out at a hotel for the night. With everything that's happened, Kim still decides to go to the courthouse the next morning for her clients, and while there, she's met by Howard, who'd fallen into a deep depression for a while, carrying the guilt of Chuck's death, but has now managed to get back on his feet as HHM has begun thriving once again. In an attempt to make up for the wrongs of his past, he met with Jimmy earlier and offered him a job at HHM, but this rubbed Jimmy the wrong way, so he just started messing with Howard by throwing bowling balls at his car and sending prostitutes during his business lunch. So now Howard confronts Kim about this and suggests that Jimmy's behavior is not only damaging to himself, but to her as well, as he believes it was Jimmy that caused her to drop Mesa Verde. And this assumption angers Kim, who claims they're perfectly fine and that she makes her own decisions. While Kim was at the courthouse, Jimmy went over to Mike's house, looking for more information on Lalo, and after displaying his fear of losing Kim, Mike informs him that Lalo will be dead by the end of the night. With Nacho now having become Lalo's most trusted associate, Lalo decided to bring him along on his trip to Mexico, looking to get him a promotion in the cartel hierarchy. But as we know, Nacho's still working for Gus, so when the planned hit comes to fruition, Nacho's the one who causes the distraction and opens the gate to allow Gus's hitmen in. But Lalo proves to be a more formidable opponent than they had thought, and manages to take them all out before faking his own death by killing a neighbor that bared a resemblance to him and burning his corpse. Back in Albuquerque, after returning to their hotel, Jimmy and Kim began jokingly discussing ways they could mess with Howard, until it eventually got more serious, with Kim suggesting to potentially destroy his career so they can finally get Jimmy's share of the Sandpiper case. He warns her that she won't be okay with what they'd have to do, but she seems even more ready for what could come than he is. With all of the cartel believing Lalo's dead, their top priority is finding Nacho, who trusted that he and his father would finally be set free to start new lives after opening Lalo's gate. But it turns out Gus was never planning on letting him go, believing he would always be another loose end to worry about. And Nacho eventually realizes this, but agrees to do whatever Gus wants as long as his father is kept safe. And Mike promises to make sure Gus keeps his word. So they retrieve Nacho and bring him back to the US, where he's brought before Bolsa, Hector, and the cousins to confess that he'd been working for Alvarez, the head of a cartel in Peru. But he then shifts off the planned script to defiantly confess to Hector that he was the one who put him in a nursery home and caused his stroke, before suddenly breaking out of his zip tie with a broken shard of glass he'd secretly grabbed earlier and holding Bolsa at gunpoint. He then takes a look at Hector, then looks at Gus, and lastly looks out at Mike, watching from a distance before shooting himself in the head. Meanwhile, after faking his own death, Lalo had called Hector to inform him that he's still alive and plans on returning to kill Gus. But Hector instead suggested he find proof of the lab, so they can cut out Gus without getting cut out themselves. So Lalo headed to Germany, where he found Werner Ziegler's wife, Margaret Ziegler, who then led him to one of Werner's men from the construction of the lab, Casper, who he tortured into telling him where the lab was being built, before now making his way back to the US and hiding out in the sewers as he waits for the right moment to enter the laundry, which the lab is underneath. There, he once again calls Hector to fill him in on what he's learned, but notices that someone's tracking the call, with that someone being Gus, who'd realized Lalo was still alive after a meeting with Hector and Bolsa, who was hoping the two would finally call a truce. But based on Hector's confident smile, Gus knew there was something else going on. Lalo, of course, knows it's Gus listening in, so instead of telling Hector his real plan, he tells him that he's going back to his original plan of just killing Gus, which sends all of Gus's men and most of the laundry security to Gus's home. Throughout all this, Jimmy and Kim had been setting up their scheme against Howard, at first subtly damaging his reputation by convincing Cliff Main and some of his other associates that he has a drug addiction, as well as Jimmy impersonating him to make it appear he mistreats prostitutes, until Howard learned of their scheme and sent a private investigator to follow Jimmy's every move. Kim also feels that she's being followed, but it doesn't appear to be Howard's PI, and after confronting them, she's met by Mike Ehrmantraut, who informs her that Lalo's still alive, so he's having his men watch over her and Jimmy in case he shows up, and asks her to just pretend they aren't there, to which she agrees and also decides to not tell Jimmy about for now. But going back to Howard's PI, it turns out he's actually secretly been working for Kim and Jimmy, so the photos he was bringing into Howard were set up by them, and eventually their big plan comes to fruition during a mediation between Sandpiper's lawyers, HHM, and Davis and Main, with the PI having brought in photos that convinced Howard that the mediator for their meeting, Judge Casimiro, was being paid off by Jimmy to make sure the case was settled. Also in the photos was a sticky substance that dilated Howard's pupils, so with him throwing out wild accusations with no evidence, since the photos were later swapped out by his PI without him knowing, and him appearing to be on drugs, Cliff is forced to settle. Later that night, Howard confronts Jimmy and Kim at their home about their elaborate scheme, and expresses his disappointment disappointment in the life Kim's decided to take on, believing she had greater potential than this. They try to get him to leave multiple times, but he refuses and continues berating them until suddenly Lalo Salamanca enters the room and shoots Howard in the head. He then gives Jimmy his car keys, a gun, and an address to which he wants him to go and kill the home's owner. But Jimmy instead says Kim should do it, and Lalo, not really caring who does, agrees. So Kim begins making her way to the home, and as she does, Lalo ties Jimmy to a chair and tells him about what happened at his home thanks to Ignacio Varga. And since Nacho introduced him to Jimmy, he no longer has any trust in him either. Jimmy tries to plead that he knew nothing about what Ignacio was gonna do.
It wasn't me, it was the guy.
But Lalo just puts a gag in his mouth and exits the apartment. Kim, meanwhile, has made it to the home and gets ready to kill its resident. But right when the door opens, Mike shows up behind her and grabs the gun out of her hand before shoving her inside of what turns out to be the home of Gustavo Fring. Upon learning that Lalo is at their apartment, Mike heads over there with a squad of his men, but all they end up finding is Jimmy, still tied up and alone. While back at Fring's house, Gus, who's still hiding inside his bunker, calls Victor and asks for the phone to be handed over to Kim, curious as to why Lalo sent her. And Kim replies that he actually wanted to send Jimmy originally, but he was able to convince him to send her instead. This leaves Gus confused, not understanding why Lalo would voluntarily change his plan, and quickly realizes that this was all just a diversion, as Lalo has actually made his way to the laundry. Gus arrives there soon after with a few of his men, but they're quickly shot down by Lalo, and Gus is then forced at gunpoint to give him a tour of the lab as he records the whole thing. Now having gotten everything he needs out of Gus, Lalo looks to kill him, but before he can, Gus stomps on a power cable, which brings the lab to complete darkness, and sprints towards a gun he'd previously hidden inside the lab in case of a scenario like this. The two engage in a shootout through the darkness until Gus runs out of bullets, and when he turns the lights back on, it's revealed that he'd landed a fatal shot, with Lalo smiling as he dies. Mike and his men then clean up Howard's body before taking him to and burying him underneath the lab beside Lalo. With this all appearing to finally be over, although they're never told whether or not Lalo's actually dead, Jimmy and Kim try to go back to life as it was, per Mike's advice. But the guilt proves to be too much for Kim to handle, and she decides to retire from being a lawyer. She also comes to the realization that her and Jimmy staying together is not only bad for them, but for everyone around them, so she tells him she loves him one last time before leaving to put an end to their romance. Over the next several months, Jimmy completely transforms himself and really begins leaning into his Saul Goodman persona, now living in a very expensive house and sleeping around with prostitutes, as his law practice has continued to gain more and more traction thanks to his known previous association with Lalo. Although he appears to have no care for what he'd gone through in his past, when set to meet with Kim for what looks to be the final time so they can sign off on their divorce, he seems shooken up and saddened. But once Kim enters his office, he reverts back to the carefree Saul Goodman. Kim's completely taken aback by how Jimmy's handling everything, and outside she displays her displeasure when being approached by a local drug dealer, Jesse Pinkman, whose partner Emilio Koyama is looking to hire Saul as his lawyer. So Jesse asks her if Saul's really worth the hire, to which she responds, "When I knew him, he was." Around 4 years later, Emilio actually ends up getting caught while cooking meth by previously mentioned DEA agents Hank and Gomez, and although Jesse manages to escape out the window, he ends up getting recognized from inside the DEA's car by his former high school chemistry teacher, Walter White. A few days prior to this, Walt had been celebrating his 50th birthday with his family and friends, including his pregnant wife Skylar, his son Walter Jr., born with cerebral palsy, and his brother-in-law Hank, whom during said celebration showcased a news broadcast covering the $700,000 he'd recently seized from a small-time meth lab. And this large amount of money caught Walt's attention, as he's been struggling to make ends meet even whilst working 2 jobs as a high school teacher and cashier at a car wash under his exploitative boss Bogdan. Hank recognized his interest and offered to take him on a ride along sometime, which Walt eventually agrees to a couple days later after suddenly collapsing to the floor while at work and being diagnosed with stage 3 lung cancer, resulting in him quitting his job at the car wash, though he's kept his diagnosis hidden from his family for the time being. This brings us back to the moment he spots Jesse from the back seat, but instead of turning him in, Walt tracks him down later that night and suggests they partner up.
You know the business, and I know the chemistry.
Although hesitant at first, Jesse ultimately agrees, and the two begin using a used RV to function as a mobile meth lab. They take it out far into the desert and cook their first batch, which Jesse describes as the best he's ever seen, and looks to sell through his associate, Crazy 8, who's no longer under the Salamanca's employ and has established himself as a solo drug dealer, taking advantage of his relations with the DEA. Turns out he's also the cousin of Jesse's former partner, Emilio, and it appears that he was actually the one who ratted him out, but he's managed to get him out on bail and convince him that it was Jesse who snitched, so the two threaten him into taking them to meet his cook. And once there, Emilio recognizes Walter, since he'd been with the DEA when he got busted, so they look to kill them, but Walt's able to to make a deal, offering up his formula in exchange for their lives. Instead of showcasing his formula though, Walt creates an explosive poisonous gas that incapacitates Crazy 8 and kills Emilio. So they're now left with the responsibility of killing Crazy 8. So to decide who has to do it, they flip a coin and it lands on Walt. Walt spends the next day trying to find a good reason not to kill Domingo, but he's ultimately forced to commit his second murder after noticing Domingo had stolen a broken piece of plate dropped earlier and intended to kill him with it. He then rids of the body and returns home, and upon his return, he informs his family that he has cancer. A few days later, Walt and Skyler attend his former best friend Elliot's birthday party, during which it's revealed that he and Walt had actually co-founded their own scientific research company, Gray Matter Technologies, after graduating college. At that time, Walt had been dating his lab assistant, Gretchen, but while on vacation with her and her family, he began feeling inferior to their wealth, and decided to break up with her, as well as sell his share of the company for $5,000. Well, since then, Gretchen and Elliot had formed a relationship and are now married, while Gray Matter is now worth billions of dollars. They've appeared to make amends since though, and at the party, Elliot even offers Walt a job at the company, but he declines upon learning Skyler had told him about his diagnosis. And believing his offer to be charity, which he refuses to accept, Walt instead continues cooking with Jesse to pay his medical bills, but convinces Skyler they're being paid by Gretchen and Elliot. Although they've got plenty of product cooked up, Jesse has struggled to sell as much of it as Walt had hoped, so he suggests they sell it wholesale to a distributor, and Jesse's friend Skinny Pete claims to know just the guy, having shared a cell with Tuco Salamanca, who by this point had gotten out of prison and began running the family meth business. So Skinny sets up a meeting between him and Jesse, but rather than pay for their product, Tuco just beats him within an inch of his life and steals it, which prompts Walt to step up in his absence, under his criminal alias Heisenberg, meeting with and threatening Tuco by creating a fulminated mercury explosion, which gains his respect, so he agrees to form a partnership with them. But before their next meeting, Walt and Jesse are forced to change up their formula, as pseudo's in short supply, so they begin using methylamine instead, giving their signature blue sky its color, which makes no difference to Tuco, and their agreed exchange goes as planned, until Tuco's associate No-Dose talks out of line, prompting Tuco to suddenly beat him to death with his bare hands. This sudden act of violence makes Walt and Jesse rethink their partnership, and the two make plans to kill Tuco, with Walt processing castor beans into ricin so they can poison him when the opportunity presents itself. But before they can gain said opportunity, Tuco kidnaps them, with plans of taking them to Mexico so they can continue cooking for him while he lays low from the cops, as he'd been forced on the run after No-Dose's body was found by the DEA, along with his other associate, Gonzo, who was crushed and killed by a car while trying to hide No-Dose's corpse. While waiting for his cousins to pick them up, Tuco puts together dinner, presenting them with the perfect opportunity to poison him, but they don't realize his seemingly brain-dead uncle, Hector, who's been under his care since Lalo's passing, is aware of what's going on, until he uses his bell to warn Tuco, who then drags Jesse outside and points an assault rifle at his head. But Walt's able to distract him long enough for Jesse to whack him in the head with a rock before grabbing and shooting him in the stomach with his own gun. Before they can finish the job though, they see a car in the distance approaching the home, so they find a place to hide. But the car turns out not to be that of Tuco's cousins, but to actually be Walt's brother-in-law, Hank. Hank hadn't shown up expecting to have a shootout with Tuco though, but rather was actually looking for Walt, whose family had grown concerned after he'd gone missing for a few days. And after learning from Skyler that Walt had apparently been buying weed from Jesse Pinkman, which Walt had told her to lower her suspicion of his criminal activity, Hank went looking for Jesse and eventually tracked down his car, surprisingly in the possession of Tuco, who was bleeding out against it. Still, Hank managed to kill him, and Walt and Jesse are able to excuse their disappearance. So they get back to cooking under their own employ and create a team of dealers in the form of Jesse's friends Skinny Pete, Combo, and Badger. Things go pretty well for a bit, but soon Skinny gets robbed of some product by a couple of meth heads. So Jesse tracks them down and demands they give him his money, but the only money they still have is in this giant ATM they stole and don't know how to open. And things quickly get out of hand while they're trying to open it, as the couple argues constantly, and eventually the woman decides she's heard enough and crushes the guy's head with the machine. Jesse's pretty shaken up by this, but this turns out to be a good thing, as people on the street are under the impression that it was Jesse that crushed that guy's head in, so they're able to begin expanding their territory. Just as they begin their expansion though, Badger ends up getting caught by an undercover cop, so to get him off, Jesse suggests they hire Saul Goodman, referencing how he'd managed to get Emilio off twice in the past when they had him dead to rights.
Seriously, when the going gets tough, you don't want a criminal lawyer, right? You want a criminal lawyer.
So Walt meets with him pretending to be Badger's uncle, but it doesn't go how they'd hoped, with Saul planning on having Badger take a deal with the DEA and tell them what he knows about Heisenberg, who the DEA, and more specifically Hank, have been trying desperately to track down. So they kidnap him later that night, giving Saul PTSD from that shootout in the desert years ago.
Whatever this is, can we please don't do it in the desert? Anywhere but the desert! Oh!
Upon arriving there and being held at gunpoint, Saul immediately believes they'd been sent by Lalo, as he's still unaware if he's truly dead.
No, it wasn't me, it was Ignacio, he's the one!
but he quickly realizes he's not in any actual danger and eventually agrees to partner with them, as he later gets Badger a shortened sentence by running a con on the DEA and subsequently begins laundering their money. Not too long after this, Walt undergoes some tests to see if his treatment had reduced the size of his tumor, and although he won't receive the results for another 4 days, he doesn't believe they'll be good, so he convinces Jesse to get one last big cook in over said 4 days. But when they eventually make it back after nearly getting stranded in the middle of the desert, Walt's shocked to learn that he's in remission, and although it seems to be delightful news for his family, he appears frustrated by it. Throughout all this going on in Walt's personal life, Jesse has added someone new into his, that being his new landlord Jane, who also happens to be a recovering drug addict. Still, the two quickly started dating and began to fall in love, but the good times are put on hold as their crew once again finds themselves in some trouble, this time with Combo being fatally shot by a young boy sent by a rival gang. To prevent this type of thing from happening again, Walt and Jesse look for a new way to move their product, and Saul claims to know an honest-to-God businessman.
Let's just say I know a guy who knows a guy who knows another guy.
Turns out the guys he's talking about are Mike Ehrmantraut, who now also works as Saul's personal PI, and Gustavo Fring. But Gus seems skeptical about working with them, so to see whether he can trust them or not, he sets up a timed deal, requesting their product be brought to a specific location within the hour. Unfortunately, they've been keeping their product at Jesse's house, who's knocked out cold when Walt gets there. In an attempt to ease his guilt over Combo's death, Jesse's been getting into even harder drugs, specifically heroin, introduced to him by Jane, who decided to break her 18-month sobriety to join him in his endeavor. Still, Walt's able to find the stuff, but just as he's about to leave, he gets a text from Skylar saying she's in labor. He ultimately chooses to complete the deal though, making $1.3 million out of it, and misses out on his daughter's birth. Feeling this is Jesse's fault, he refuses to give him his half of the money until he cleans himself up. And around the same time, Jane's father Donald finds out she'd broken her sobriety and tries to break them up. So they decide to blackmail Walt into giving them Jesse's share of the money, and begin making plans of sobering up and moving away together, although they do still look to finish off the drugs they have left. After handing over the money, Walt heads to a nearby bar, and sits down next to who we recognize to be Jane's father, although Walt doesn't know that at the time. The two end up having a conversation about kids and how difficult it is to take care of them, and this conversation prompts Walt to go back to Jesse's house so they can make amends. But when he gets there, he finds them both passed out once again, until suddenly Jane begins overdosing. Walt goes to help her at first, but stops in his tracks and instead watches her die, believing it's what's best for his hold on Jesse. The next morning, a heartbroken Jesse finds her dead beside him, so he calls Walt, who then calls Saul, who then sends Mike to clean the place up and tell Jesse what to say for when authorities arrive. And her death ultimately leads to him entering himself into rehab, as Walt expected. Also greatly affected by Jane's death is her father, who took some time off of work following her passing, with him being an air traffic controller. But after a few weeks, he decides to return to his job. This turns out to be a bad idea though, and his grief proves to be too overwhelming, as he inadvertently allows two planes to collide into one another, resulting in an explosion that kills 167 people. Adding on to this hole Walt's dug himself into, it turns out his lies have finally caught up to him, as Skylar's learned that Gretchen and Elliot haven't actually paid a single penny of their medical expenses, and after putting two and two together, she realizes that Walt must be a drug dealer. So she kicks him out and asks for a divorce, leading to him ending his business relationship with Gus and quitting the meth business altogether in an attempt to save their marriage. But his attempts to reconcile are constantly shut down, and Skylar even begins having an affair with her boss, Ted Beneke. In response, Walt attempts to have an affair of his own with the principal of the school he works at, Carmen, but he's swiftly shut down and fired. Jesse, meanwhile, has completed rehab, and although Walt stepped away from cooking, Jesse's decided to start back up again on his own. Following what he believes to be a successful cook, he meets with Walt, hoping he can set up a meeting for him with Gus. But Walt refuses, outraged that Jesse's attempting to sell what he considers his product. So Jesse has Saul set it up instead, but when making the transaction with Victor, he's only paid half the agreed amount, as Gus had the other half delivered to Walt. Walt then meets with Gus, as he'd expected, which allows Gus the opportunity to present him with the now completed meth superlab. And it proves to be enough to convince Walt to return to cooking. Jesse doesn't get hired alongside him though, as Gus didn't actually want to work with him, believing he's just a junkie. And instead Walt's paired with a man named Gail Bedeker, who Gus had originally planned to have work as his primary cook when first constructing the lab. And the two chemists take an immediate liking to one another, with Gail even gifting him a book from one of his favorite poets, Walt Whitman, while a frustrated Jesse decides to continue cooking anyway, still working from inside the RV. Soon though, the two are nearly caught in their endeavor by Hank, who throughout this has continued his search for Heisenberg and has now discovered the RV, as it was caught on camera at a gas station where Jesse had sold the cashier his product. which eventually led to Hank tracking down Combo's mother, who revealed her son and Jesse had stolen her IV a while ago. So Hank began tailing Jesse, who quickly led him to the vehicle, but luckily for the latter, Hank had called Walt earlier, asking if he remembered seeing Jesse in possession of an RV during their past relations. So Walt makes his way down there just before Hank, and forces him to exit with the help of Saul, who had Francesca call him, claiming to be an employee at a hospital, and convince him that his wife Marie was in a car accident. His exit then allows them to destroy the vehicle, but once Hank realizes he's been fooled, he makes his way to Jesse's house and beats him senseless. Upon regaining consciousness in the hospital, Jesse expresses his plans to Walt and Saul of destroying Hank's career and life with a lawsuit. So to cool him down, Walt says he'll convince Gus to hire him so they can partner up once again. Although things seem to have worked out in a mostly positive direction, Hank's life is soon threatened by the arrival of the Salamanca twins, Lionel and Marco, who had returned to the US in search of Tuco's killer, who they're at first told by Hector was Walter White. Just as they arrived to kill him though, they were called away by Gus, who informed them that he needed Walt alive and instead shifted their attention to Hank, since he's Tuco's actual killer. So the cousins now look to exact their revenge. But before they arrive, Hank receives an anonymous phone call from Gus, warning him of their planned attack, which allows him to gain the advantage as he runs into Lionel with his car. He still ends up getting shot twice by Marco, who then looks to finish the job with an axe, but this gives Hank just enough time to reload his gun and shoot him in the head. A still alive but critically injured Lionel also dies later while in the hospital after Gus sends Mike to poison him, and the cousins' actions lead to Juan Bolsa calling Gus and accusing him of being behind the hit. But Gus had already planned against this and has Mexican authorities kill Bolsa. Although still alive, Hank is also critically injured and will need treatment in order to ever walk again. But he and his wife Marie unfortunately don't have the money for it, so Skylar offers that she and Walt pay for it, revealing the large amount of money he's made, but covering it up as the result of gambling. And now, having crafted this lie, she allows him to return home and they begin working together, as well as with Saul, to launder his money through the car wash Walt used to work at that they've now bought. Jesse, meanwhile, has continued going to his AA meetings, through which he's met a woman named Andrea, a single mother with a son named Brock, and whom he quickly starts dating. As they spend more time together, Andrea starts opening up about her family and the life her brother Tomas has taken on, with him working as a drug dealer. And she explains one particular traumatic incident in which he was sent to kill a dealer from a rival gang, and Jesse quickly realizes that rival gang's dealer to be Combo. So he heads to that same corner Combo was shot on and learns that not only was it really Tomas that killed him, but the gang he works for is selling his and Walt's product, meaning they're also working for Gus. So he confronts Walt about this, and Walt sets up a meeting between him, Gus, and the two dealers, in which they agree to no longer involve kids in their operation. But instead of just letting Tomas go, the two men decide to kill him. So Jesse tracks them down and it looks like they're about to have a shootout, until they're suddenly run over and killed by Walt. The next morning, Walt's confronted by a furious Gus, Mike, and Victor, but he isn't worried they'll kill him since no one else can cook meth as pure as his, and ultimately they agree to let him go back to cooking, although he's once again forced to work alongside Gale. At the behest of Gus, Gale studies Walt's technique over their next few cooks, and eventually feels he's able to replicate his formula, which allows Gus to send the order for Mike and Victor to kill Walt. In an attempt to get out of it, Walt says he'll give up Jesse's location, who's been in hiding since the incident, but when they allow him to make the call, instead of giving him up, he tells Jesse that he has to be the one to kill Gale and hangs up. Walt had realized early on that Gus planned on replacing him with Gale, so he worked with Jesse and Saul to figure out where he lived so that he could kill him first. But as he was on his way to do so, Mike and Victor picked him up, so now Jesse has to be the one to do it. And after making it to Gale's apartment, he reluctantly does kill him, and is only caught after the fact by Victor, who takes him back to the lab as they await Gus's punishment. But rather than killing either Walt or Jesse, he ends up killing Victor, since he was seen by civilians when he arrived at Gale's apartment, before telling them to get back to work. Witnessing Gus kill one of his most loyal employees stirs up a great load of fear in Walt, believing he could very well do the same to him, so he privately meets with Mike, who's also having a hard time stomaching Gus's murder of Victor, to set up his assassination. But Mike instead just beats the crap out of him. Soon, Gale's death begins getting looked into by the DEA, as he had lab notes in his apartment that documented the cooking process, bringing Hank to the conclusion that he may have been Heisenberg. Also in his lab notes was an inscription made out to WW, which Hank questions Walt about.
WW. I mean, who you figure that is, huh? Walter White?
You got me.
But Walt's able to explain that it's actually a quote from a Walt Whitman poem. This appears to finally close the book on Hank's hunt for Heisenberg, until later, during a family dinner, Walt drinks way too much wine, compensating for the stress brought on by his current situation, and after Hank refers to Gale as a genius, he allows his pride to take over, and claims Gale was likely just copying the real Heisenberg, hinting he may still be out there. Walt's current state worries Skylar, fearing that he may be in danger, but in response, Walt claims he is the danger.
A guy opens his door and gets shot, and you think that of me? No. I am the one who knocks.
This doesn't have the intended effect on her though, and only makes her more afraid. Meanwhile, Jesse, having committed his first murder, doesn't seem to really care whether he lives or dies, and his drug use becomes more constant than ever. So to prevent him from getting high, Gus has Mike take him on a few ride-alongs, during which he actually proves himself to be of good use, and Gus begins taking a liking to him. But Walt believes this growing relationship between the two is their opportunity to kill Gus, so he makes some more ricin and has Jesse hide it in his cigarette pack to be used when the opportunity presents itself. The next time Jesse sees Gus though, he's taken to a meeting between Gus and another branch of the cartel, overseen by a man named Gaff, in which tensions begin to rise between the two, nearly starting a cartel civil war. So to smooth things over, Gus brings Jesse along with him to Mexico so he can teach them how to cook his formula, and there he proves he's capable of matching Walt's purity level on his own. He's then brought to meet Don Eladio, who Gus gifts a bottle of tequila as a sign of good faith and takes the first sip to prove it's not poisoned. But it turns out it actually was poisoned, with Gus throwing it up in the bathroom, and he finally gets his revenge on Eladio, killing him and his men. As they're making their exit though, a surviving member of his crew fires at them, landing a shot on Mike, and with Gus incapacitated from the growing effects of the poison, Jesse's forced to have a shootout with the man and manages to come out on top. Later, once they're back in the US, we learn that the man Jesse killed was actually the last remaining Salamanca other than Hector, Joaquin Salamanca, his grandson.
Now, the Salamanca name dies with you.
After his doctor Barry patches him and Mike up, Gus, having learned Jesse's capabilities as a lone cook and wanting to get rid of Walt, proposes for Jesse to begin working for him alone. And recently, Jesse's been having his own problems with Walt, as Walt had grown furious with him for not having killed Gus already, leading to the two engaging in a brawl. So he agrees to cook alone as long as Gus doesn't kill Walt, and Gus agrees, later firing Walt, though he still threatens to kill him and his family if he chooses to interfere with any of his business. The next of which being to kill Hank, who's begun looking into Gus's connections with Heisenberg, who, because of Walt, he still believes is out there, upon learning he and Gail had been in communication prior to his death. Jesse, meanwhile, now having sobered up, continues building his relationship with Andrea and her son Brock, until one day Brock suddenly has a serious illness, which Jesse believes to have been caused by the ricin after not being able to find it where he left it. So he confronts Walt, since he was the only one who knew about it, but Walt's able to convince him that it had to have been Gus trying to trick Jesse into killing him. So the two work with the man who hates Gus most, Hector Salamanca, as Gus is most vulnerable when taunting him at his nursery home, and attach a homemade bomb to his wheelchair set to go off when he rings his bell. So when Gus meets with him to put an end to the Salamancas for good, Hector sets off the bomb, resulting in an explosion that kills them both. Walt and Jesse then burn down the lab and destroy any evidence tracing Gus's operation back to them before renewing their friendship following Brock's recovery, who it turns out hadn't actually been poisoned with ricin, but rather a plant called Lily of the Valley, that's revealed to be growing in Walt's backyard, as he actually was the one who poisoned him, working with a reluctant Saul who got Kuehl to pickpocket the cigarette off of Jesse. Mike, who had been recovering from his wound he sustained in Mexico throughout all this, soon learns of Gus's death and looks to kill Walt, but Jesse, who he's grown a liking and respect towards, is able to talk him down, and instead they propose that the three of them work together. Mike declines at first, but eventually decides to join in order to continue paying off Gus's guys in prison. They also begin working with Lydia Rodart Quayle, who acts as their supplier of methylamine, while Saul gets them a gig with pest company Vamonos Pest, who allow them to use the houses being bug bombed as mobile meth labs. They soon run into some trouble though, when Lydia notices a tracker on one of the barrels of methylamine, but she's able to form a plan in which they can acquire a ton of it by robbing a train. To help in their train heist, they bring in one of the pest control guys, Todd Alquist, and together they're able to steal 1,000 gallons of methylamine with seemingly no witnesses. That is until a young boy named Drew Sharp shows up on his bike, resulting in Todd shooting the boy with no hesitation, believing it was what's best for the team. His actions push Jesse over the edge as well as Mike, so the two say they want out and plan to sell their thirds of the methylamine to a rival gang for $5 million each. But instead, Walt convinces their buyers to work for him as distributors, and buys Mike out of the business himself. He refuses to buy Jesse out though, believing they could make way more than $5 million. But Jesse wants nothing to do with any of this anymore and just leaves without the money. With his $5 million, Mike plans to continue paying off Gus's guys, but unfortunately during a money drop, his lawyer gets caught red-handed, so Mike's forced to leave his family and skip town. But before he leaves, he's met by Walt, who asks for the names of Gus's guys since they won't be paying them anymore. But Mike refuses to give them to him, furious he put them in this situation to begin with. So Walt decides to shoot him, only to realize that he could have just gotten the names from Lydia, as Mike dies from his wound. Upon receiving the names from Lydia, who he also forms a business relationship with to expand outside of New Mexico, Walt's able to gain help from Todd's uncle Jack, the head of a white supremacist gang who has connections in prison, to kill each of Gus's men simultaneously. With no one else to worry about, Walt goes right back to cooking, now alongside Todd, Todd, and for the next 5 months makes more money than ever, before finally deciding to call it quits upon learning his cancer's back. Now in retirement, he begins spending more time with his family, but one day while having Hank and Maria over, Hank heads to the bathroom and discovers the Walt Whitman book Walt had been gifted by Gail, inside of which he notices an inscription beginning with "To my other favorite WW" and ending with "Fondly GB," prompting Hank to flash back to that night he and Walt looked through Gail's lab notes, and bringing him to the realization that Walt is Heisenberg. Walt eventually realizes Hank's discovery, resulting in a confrontation in which Hank punches him in the face, but he knows Hank can't arrest him without finding more evidence first, so he hides his money with the help of Huel and Saul's other associate, QB, who put it in barrels that he then buries in the desert at the same location of he and Jesse's first cook. Speaking of Jesse, after retiring from the business, Walt decided to finally give him his $5 million, but by this point, Jesse no longer wants what he considers blood money. His guilt over the death they left in their path begins to really take a toll on him, and his behavior becomes more and more erratic. So with Hank cracking down on them, Walt suggests he leaves town with the help of Saul's guy, Ed Galbraith, also known as Ed the Disappearer, who could provide him with a new life and identity, and Jesse agrees. Saul warns him not to get high before the pickup since the guy won't take him if he is, but Jesse continues smoking anyways, so Saul has Huel pickpocket it from him as he leaves. But this brings Jesse to the realization of what really happened to Brock, so he declines to enter Ed's vehicle and instead storms back into Saul's office, punches him in the face, and forces him at gunpoint to tell him everything. He then heads to Walt's house while no one's home with the intention of burning it down, but is ultimately stopped by Hank, who convinces him to instead work with him to take Walt down. So Jesse tells him, as well as Steve Gomez, everything that's gone down over the past year on tape. But in order to prove what he's saying is true, they still need some physical evidence. So they set up a scheme that convinces Huel Walt's gone on a killing spree, and learn Walt's money is buried somewhere in the desert, before Jesse then sends Walt a photo that convinces him he's found his money and gets him to rush over to its location. Walt, upon realizing it was a trap and believing Jesse's about to kill him, calls in Todd's uncle and his gang for help, but after seeing Jesse arrive with Hank, he calls them off and allows himself to be put under arrest. But Jack's gang decides to show up anyways and engage in a huge shootout with Hank and Gomez, resulting in the latter being killed. Walt tries to prevent them from killing Hank too, even offering to give them all of his money, but they instead just shoot Hank in the head and steal each barrel of cash but one, before shifting their attention to Jesse, who Todd suggests they bring back with them to find out what the DEA knows, and they agree. So they take him to their compound to be beaten and tortured, but even after he's told them everything, they decide against killing him, since they and Lydia have been needing a new cook ever since Walt went into retirement, and instead keep him chained up in their lab with the use of a contraption built by their associate Neil Candy. Jesse quickly makes an attempt to escape, but he's ultimately caught, and this attempt results in Todd heading to Andrea's house and killing her with a shot to the head.
Hey, remember, you're still a kid.
Walt, meanwhile, rushes back home to inform his family that they're moving out of town, planning to get them all new lives. But upon learning he killed Hank, Skylar refuses, leading to a fight over a knife that leaves her and Walter Jr. frightened. So he leaves alone, being picked up by Ed, who later picks up Saul as his relations with Walt have forced him out of town as well, and the two spend the next couple days shacked up in the basement of Ed's vacuum cleaner repair shop before moving on to brand new lives. While Saul moves to Nebraska and Walt heads to New Hampshire, Jesse is still trapped in New Mexico, although he does nearly find a way out, as after a few months of slaving away as their cook, he and Todd are left alone at Jack's compound while the rest of the gang is out water skiing. And it just so happens that Todd needs his help with something, so he brings Jesse with him to his apartment, where it's revealed he had killed his housekeeper Sonia after she found his stash of money, originally kept inside these old hollowed out encyclopedias.
Nothing beats cash on hand, that's what Uncle Jack says.
So he has Jesse help him toss her out the window and load her into his El Camino, before driving out into the desert and having Jesse dig her grave. He then holds a short funeral ceremony, during which he runs out of cigarettes, so he asks Jesse to grab a new pack from the glove box. But Jesse instead grabs Todd's gun and contemplates whether or not to kill him with it, but ultimately he decides not to, worried of what would happen to Brock if he does. Meanwhile, Walt spends the next several months stuck living in a cabin in the woods, with his only connection to the outside world being his few chemotherapy sessions with Ed. But a few days before his 52nd birthday, he decides to leave the cabin and heads to a bar in the nearby town, in which he calls his son's school and attempts to give him the last $10 million still in his possession, but he refuses, no longer wanting anything to do with him. Walt soon thinks up a different way to send his family the money though, after seeing an interview on TV of Gretchen and Elliot, in which they downplay Walt's involvement in the creation of their company. So he decides to pay them a visit, and has them put his money in a trust for when his son turns 18, threatening to have them assassinated if they they don't. He didn't actually hire assassins though, and instead just had Badger and Skinny Pete hold up some laser pointers, but it works nonetheless. And through Badger and Skinny, he learns that his product is still being sold, prompting him to put together one last scheme, beginning with him purchasing an M60 before heading to his old house to grab the ricin, which he'd kept behind a wall outlet. He then interrupts a meeting between Todd and Lydia, knowing she abides by a strict schedule, and convinces them to let him over Jack's compound that night by making it appear he's desperate for cash and could teach them a new formula without the use of methylamine. Before he heads to the compound though, he tracks down Skylar to apologize for everything, and instead of defending his actions as having been for his family, he finally tells the truth and admits that he really just did it for himself. He also gives her the coordinates of where Hank and Steve were buried so she can make a deal with the prosecutor before seeing his children one last time and heading to confront Jack and his gang. They immediately look to kill him though, so he comes at Jack's pride, pointing out how instead of killing Jesse, he partnered with him, which gets Jack to bring Jesse out, laughing at the idea of them being considered partners. Although Walt may have initially planned to include Jesse in his revenge scheme, after seeing what they've put him through, he instead tackles him to the ground as he opens the trunk of his car, which activates the mounted M60 rigged to a rotating motor inside that fires through the wall of their clubhouse and kills Jack's entire gang, outside of him and Todd. So Jesse finishes off Todd himself by strangling him with the chains around his wrists, while Walt finishes Jack with a bullet to the head. Walt then slides the gun to Jesse and gives him the opportunity to kill him, but after seeing Walt had also been hit by the M60, he instead tells him to do it himself before making his way towards Todd's El Camino. It's also soon revealed what Walt used the ricin for, as Todd receives a call from Lydia and Walt answers to explain that he had slipped it into her stevia earlier, and the poison results in her death not too long after the call. So with every loose end taken care of, Walt watches as Jesse drives off before heading into the lab, inside of which he collapses to the floor and is surrounded by police as he dies from his wound. Having finally escaped captivity, Jesse makes his way over to Skinny's house and gains his and Badger's help in getting Todd's car off the street. They also give him some food and a bed to sleep in for the night, as well as letting him take his first shower in months. And once he's all washed up, he makes a call to an old associate, Old Joe, who had previously helped him and Walt destroy their RV. But although Joe initially agrees to help get rid of Todd's car, upon learning the cops are tracking it, he instead heads back to his junkyard. So Skinny comes up with a new plan, willing to take some heat from the cops, and says to leave the El Camino at his house, while Badger takes his car and drops it off near the border, and Jesse takes Badger's car. He and Badger then give Jesse the money they got for helping Walt earlier, and Jesse heads off to Todd's apartment, hoping he has some money still hidden in there. He manages to sneak his way in and begins looking through his old encyclopedias, but the money's no longer there, and he's unable to find the money anywhere throughout the whole apartment. As he's searching though, he sees through the window of another apartment a news broadcast featuring his parents, pleading for him to turn himself in, and as his frustration builds, it results in him banging his head against Todd's refrigerator. But when he does, he hears something move within the door of it, and discovers the money's actually inside. But before he can collect it, two men in police jackets arrive, so he attempts to hide as they search throughout the place. He ends up quickly being found though, forcing him to hold one of the officers at gunpoint while having a standoff with the other, until he ultimately gives himself up, not wanting any more innocent lives being taken. But it's soon revealed that these guys aren't actually cops, but just a couple criminals also in search of Todd's money, with their names being Casey and Todd's former associate, Neil Candy. It looks like they're about to kill Jesse, but he's able to talk his way out of it, claiming he knows where the money is and that they won't be able to find it on their own. So they allow him to take them to it, and upon revealing its location, he begins collecting a third of it, aware that they can't kill him without raising suspicion of the place's owner. So now, having gained a good chunk of money, he begins searching for Saul's guy, Ed, but can't remember the name of his shop. Luckily for him, he ends up finding the red van Ed had arrived in to pick him up earlier, parked outside of Best Quality Vacuum, which he then enters to attempt convincing Ed to take him on the deal they agreed to that day. But since he didn't show up for that original pickup, if he wants his help now, he'll have to pay double the price, which would be $250,000. Unfortunately, Jesse only has $248,200, so in order to get the remaining $1,800, he makes plans on confronting Neil. Before he does though, he makes a call to his parents and makes them believe he's ready to turn himself in, asking for them to pick him up while also letting them know that they're not at fault for the way he turned out. But this call was actually just so he could lure them and the cops away from the house, which he then sneaks into to steal the guns from their safe. He then arrives at Neil's office, who had just finished partying with Casey and some friends, and asks if they'll lend him the $1,800 he needs. Neil obviously doesn't go for that, and instead makes a bet, putting up his third of the money for Jesse's third in a shootout.
Like the Wild West?
Yeah.
like the Wild West.
So the two stand off, prepared to draw, and the first to do so is Neil, but before he can fire, he's fatally shot 5 times, as Jesse had another gun hidden in his jacket pocket. He then engages in a shootout with Casey that ends with Casey being shot in the head, before letting their friends walk, taking Neil's money, and leaving his office, setting the place to blow as he does. Having gathered enough money, he's finally able to begin a new life and decides to move to Alaska, calling back to a conversation he had with Mike prior to them selling the methylamine, who said if he was in Jesse's position, that's where he would want to start his new life. Saul, meanwhile, has successfully carved out a new life for himself as Gene Tekovic, the manager of a Cinnabon in Omaha, Nebraska. Gene lives a much less luxurious lifestyle than Saul, being in constant paranoia that he might get recognized. And this eventually leads to him collapsing to the floor one day while at work and being sent to the hospital. Luckily, no one there learns of his real identity, so he heads back home, calling a taxi to pick him up. But inside the car, he notices an Albuquerque Isotopes air freshener, as the driver stares at him for an uncomfortable amount of time, so he asks to be let out and finds his own way home. Worried that the driver may have recognized him, he calls out of work for the next few days and attempts to stay hidden, but after finding no signs of him being followed or searched for, he eventually goes back to work, where during his lunch break, he's approached by the taxi driver, Jeff, who says he used to live in Albuquerque with his ex and remembers Saul's face being everywhere. Gene tries to play dumb, but Jeff doesn't buy it and eventually gets him to admit who he really is.
Better Call Saul.
He and his friend Buddy then exit, and Gene goes straight to the phone, calling Ed to once again receive a new identity. But mid-phone call, he suddenly changes his mind and instead takes this opportunity to jump back into what he does best, running cons. So he meets with Jeff at his home, having befriended his mother Marion earlier, and offers him and Buddy a chance to make some cash, to which they agree. So they spend the next couple weeks preparing to rob the mall Gene works at, with Gene teaching them the ins and outs of it while also befriending the night shift security guards to create an opening for it to go down. And the robbery manages to be a success, but although everything went well, Gene doesn't plan to continue doing this type of stuff, at least not at first. He later talks on the phone with Francesca to touch base for the first time about what's gone down since he left, and learns of Walt's death and Jesse's disappearance, as well as all of his shell accounts being found by the feds. Although there is some good news about Huel, since he was let off after being held under false pretenses. She also reveals that she'd received a call from Kim, checking in on her and asking if he was still alive, which raises Gene's spirits. So much so that he decides to call Kim up from her current office job at Palm Coast Sprinklers in Titusville, Florida. But the call doesn't go the way he'd hoped, with her saying he should turn himself in. So he flips it onto her, questioning why he should when she hasn't even done so herself after all that went down with Howard, prompting her to suddenly end the phone call. Frustrated, Gene decides to continue running cons with Jeff and Buddy, and begins working with them to con a bunch of rich guys at bars, with Gene getting them super drunk so that Jeff can arrive in his cab to take them home, and give them water spiked with a drug that incapacitates them, allowing Buddy to enter their homes and snap photos of all of their personal and financial information, which they then sell to identity thieves. This goes well for a couple weeks until one night when Gene decides to con a man with cancer, which leads to Buddy getting cold feet and not finishing the job. So Gene fires him and has Jeff drive him to the home so he can do it himself. But while waiting outside, Jeff notices a cop car parked behind him, resulting in him panicking and crashing his car. The next day, Gene calls up Marion so she can help get Jeff bailed out, but she's suspicious as to why Jeff would call him and not her after getting arrested. Adding to her suspicion is the fact that she'd seen him yelling at Buddy the night before in her garage. So after learning he used to live in Albuquerque, she instead searches up Albuquerque conmen, and there she discovers that Gene is really Saul Goodman. So she calls the police and Saul is forced to go on the run, although he's quickly caught while hiding in a dumpster. And things look pretty bad at first, as the prosecution looks to put him away for life plus 190 years, and even brings in Hank's wife Marie. But Saul's able to flip the story, claiming he's just another innocent victim of Walter White's, knowing that their case against him would be in jeopardy if even one member of the jury believes his retelling of things. He's able to talk them all the way down to 7.5 years, and is even able to pick a specific location for his imprisonment. He wants one more condition added to their agreement though, that being to receive mint chocolate chip ice cream every Friday. So he begins revealing the truth of what happened to Howard Hamlin, but it's of no use to them, as the information had already been brought in by Kim. Following their phone call earlier, Kim decided it was time she revealed the truth behind Howard's death, so she caught a flight to Albuquerque and headed to the courthouse, before then heading to the home of Howard's widow, Cheryl, and handing her a sworn statement detailing her and Jimmy's framing of Howard, as well as his death and cover-up at the hands of men working for Gus Fring. But even with her giving this statement to the DA, it's unlikely she'll go to jail since there's no physical evidence or remaining witnesses. Cheryl could sue her for everything she's got though, but Kim's willing to accept that. She then tearfully headed home and looked to do some good, offering her services at a free legal aid office. But while there, she receives a call from an old colleague, Albuquerque District Attorney Suzanne Erickson, who informs her of Saul's capture and his plans of giving a testimony that will negatively affect Kim. So she heads to Albuquerque to attend Saul's hearing, who arrives in one of his trademark flashy suits. But it turns out he doesn't actually plan on testifying against Kim, and instead, with her deciding to face the consequences of her actions, he decides he should too, since he's more responsible for anything that happened than she is, and reveals the truth of his relationship with Walter White and even expresses his regrets for destroying his brother's life. He then ends his statement asking to be called Jimmy McGill once again, and his sentence is changed back to its original length. Things don't seem like they'll be too bad for him in prison though, as he's able to form alliances with some of the inmates, aware of his career helping guys like themselves, and soon after his arrival, he's met by Kim, posing as his lawyer, and the two share a smoke one last time before silently saying their goodbyes. And that was our full timeline recap of the Breaking Bad and Better Call Saul universe. If you enjoyed the video, then make sure to leave a like and subscribe to the channel, and also let us know in the comments if you'd like for us to do more Breaking Bad or Better Call Saul content in the future. Thank you all so much for watching, and I'll talk to you again soon.